And I've made you co-host, so you should be able to share screen. Okay, yeah, we see it just fine.
Okay, great. Okay, so hopefully we can have a pretty informal, it's gonna be a pretty informal workshop, so folks should feel totally free to just jump in and make a comment, ask a question. We can have a discussion in the middle, that's cool too. So basically today I'm gonna talk about how I put together Citable and what I think are fancy supplemental materials for all of the publications for all the publications for the past year or two that I've put together. So if you want to follow along as we go, I tried to make these slides a resource that'll be useful after the talk. So there are tons of links. Feel free to there should be a link to the Google Slides. So just a little bit of a roadmap of what I'm going to talk about. So first, I just want to get everyone on the same page. So what do I mean by supplemental material and why should we bother with it? Then I'm going to talk about how to create citable supplemental material using GitHub and Zenodo. And then I'm going to go through some additional tools that I use to compose what I think is super fancy supplemental material. And then at the end, I figured we'd have a little bit of discussion of like, what do folks see as the downside to the ways that I'm going to talk about doing supplemental material? What are some other sort of ways that people have liked doing supplemental material, etc. Okay, so what do I mean by supplemental material? So this is just an ill-defined document or collection of materials that are often associated with a publication. So a journal article, a conference article, etc. And then sort of the little asterisk by collection of supplemental materials is that most publication venues have very specific requirements for supplemental information. So you're sort of, this definition is really vague. Your mileage may vary as to what it means to be supplemental material. So here's just an example. Usually it's this thing that, you navigate to the web page associated with a publication, you scroll down to the bottom, and maybe if you're lucky, there's a place for you to download whatever the supplemental materials are. And so the supplemental material often includes things like data, code, extra math equations or derivations that you don't want to jam into your paper, extra graphs analyses, results from preliminary experiments that sort of motivate why you chose the particular parameters that you chose in your paper, guides for application, more methodological details, etc. It's really just a hodgepodge of all sorts of things that you want to be linked to your publication. And so these are all especially, I think they're important for any sort of publication, but they're especially important for computational research because our code is often a large component of whatever we're publishing. And so here's just an example that I pulled from the Evolutionary Computation Journal. So it just says you can include an additional file of supplemental material containing data, additional visualizations, etc. It'll be made available online following the acceptance of the paper. There's no limits to the size of the file. So incredibly vague because you can put just about anything. It sounds like you can add any sort of file and you can put anything inside of that file. And so what you sort of have to figure out is, okay, how do I jam all of these things that I want as supplemental material into whatever the journal or the publication venue is saying I can include as supplemental material? And so oftentimes you'll see it as a single unwieldy PDF. And so I've seen things like code in a PDF, which is horrible raw data in a PDF. And if your supplemental material doesn't have code or data and you've got more of maybe a theory paper and you're just showing math equations, a single PDF is totally fine. But don't paste code into a PDF. It's awful. Another thing that you'll see a lot of the time is someone will just zip up all of the stuff, all of their files into a single archive. And that's fine. The downside to that is if you don't take care in providing like a README to the archive, then it's sort of like someone will go to replicate your work or to read the supplement, and like they unzip this archive and it's just this mess of files and folders, and it's confusing. So what I'm going to talk about today is using a GitHub repository or something similar like OSF to communicate your like package and communicate your supplemental material. Right, so why even bother with supplemental material in the first place? It takes some effort to organize and create worthwhile supplemental material. So doing something more than just taking this folder that is associated with your project, zipping it up and shoving it onto the journal's website, because that's not particularly useful to future you or readers. And reviewers are often not even going to look at your supplemental material that you spent so much time creating. So it's sort of like, why bother if the reviewers don't care, and it's just easier to like throw everything into a PDF. And so there's just some reasons that I jotted down off the top of my head. So transparency and openness. We want to be transparent, especially in computational research, with our code, what we're doing. So putting together good supplemental material is important for being transparent and open. Your code is an important component of your work, so you should present your code in sort of a context that is appropriate for code. Good supplemental material helps other folks to replicate and extend your work. So if you want other people to build on your work, make it easy for them to build on your work. It's also sort of one of the biggest selfish reasons is that future you can replicate and extend your work. So oftentimes when I go to extend a previous paper or some previous experiment, I'll go to the supplemental material that I put together for that publication, and I'll like, okay, let me read what what are the dependencies that I need to read, that helped me compile this code from a year ago. And I find my old supplemental material to be super useful in that way. Also, the very process of putting together a thorough set of supplemental material, like a guide to replicating your work, can often uncover bugs and problems with your code. And this has definitely happened to me before, where just the very process of putting together, like, okay, what's the step-by-step guide that someone needs to follow to compile my experiment and run it? It's like, oh, the version of the code that I'm pushing to GitHub right now does not actually compile. And so I found just the process of putting the supplemental material together to be useful. Okay, are there any questions so far? Otherwise, I'm going to move on to sort of how I use GitHub for fancy supplemental material, or comments.
My only question was going to be, how come you're not using GitHub? So
oh no, I'm definitely using GitHub. There are a couple of other services that I think are really useful too. So like, I know, like in the bottom right, I've linked the Open Science Framework. And you can use all of these services together. Often they'll integrate with one another. It's sort of just a question of which one do you use as your central landing page for your supplemental. I personally like GitHub a lot, but like, I'd also advocate strongly for the Open Science Framework. I think it's a great service as well. Is there anything else that anybody wants to? I don't think so. Okay, feel free to jump in at any point. So I'm gonna sort of go into this guide with the assumption that everyone is familiar with GitHub and Git and how to use Git. But just in case you're not, I'm gonna spend this one slide sort of giving an overview of what GitHub is. And basically you can think of it as a place to create and host these things called Git repositories. And these are basically just a place where you can that will contain arbitrary content. So like your code, your documentation, sort of whatever you want. Right. So all these things that are useful for supplemental material, you can throw into a Git repository and host that repository on GitHub for free. The only thing sort of that I don't recommend tossing into a GitHub repository is data, like raw data. It's fine if you only have like maybe a couple megs of data. You can probably get away with doing it on GitHub, but I really don't recommend shoving large data files onto GitHub. It's not really what it's good for. I'll show you another thing you can use later. But basically, right, so GitHub is this basically service that you can have these Git repositories. Git repositories are great because they track changes to the contents of the repository over time. And so it makes it really easy to manage and then merge changes made by different collaborators on a project, or even you on different computers. So like, even if I'm the only person writing code on a project, I still find Git repositories to be super useful because I'll often like develop things locally. Okay, develop, hop onto the HPCC, test my stuff on the HPCC and make some changes there. And so now I've got these changes that are sitting locally, these changes that are sitting on the HPCC. And so Git sort of is a useful tool for me to like easily merge and sort of manage those independent sources of changes to my code or whatever. Also, GitHub is great. There are other services that you can use for hosting Git repositories. So Git is sort of just a program that you can use. You don't need to use it with GitHub. There are things like Bitbucket and I think GitLabs, etc., that you could use to sort of host your Git repository in the cloud. I think GitHub is fantastic. It has all sorts of extra nifty features that make your life and your collaborators' lives a whole lot more pleasant, like issues, GitHub Pages, Github Actions, etc. I'm going to talk about some of these later. Okay, so Citable supplemental material with GitHub. So maybe if we're like, okay, we're going to toss all of our supplemental material into a GitHub repository, maybe all we need to do is just paste a link into our manuscript to that GitHub repository. Dunzo, we're good. There are a couple of issues with that. So just providing a link as sort of a footnote in your manuscript, it's like, hey, here's my supplemental material, just go to this link, is okay by itself, but it's really not ideal. And that's because you don't really know 10 or 20 years from now if this link is going to still work. So any link to a GitHub repository, you're going to have, https github.com. So you've got your username and then you've got your repository name. And so there are a couple of sort of vulnerabilities to these URLs. Like you're making the assumption that GitHub is not going to change their base URL. I think that's a pretty safe assumption, but it's still an assumption. You're also making the assumption that your account is going to be around for the next 20 years, or you're going to keep your username, which, who knows what's going to happen in 20 years. You're also making the assumption that your repository name is going to stay the same. And then the other thing is that your repository on GitHub, whenever you just link to it in this way, you're linking to whatever the most recent version of the repository is. And if let's say that you do a project, you publish it, you link to it as your supplemental material. A year later, you come back and you're like, I'm going to extend this, but I'm just going to keep using the same repository because I want to maintain all the same history and for whatever reason. Then this link no longer, you do some work on it for another 6 months, you publish another paper. This link in your old paper is no longer linking readers to the correct version for the paper that they're reading. So that's also, so basically, I hope that I've convinced you that a link by itself is not ideal. Sort of what our end goal for being able to cite supplemental material that's hosted on GitHub is to get this thing called a DOI, or a digital object identifier. And so these are sort of like permanent addresses, permanent IDs for some digital object. And so basically what we want to be able to do is in our publication, put together a reference that is like, okay, so whoever put together, author's year, we're just going to call it supplemental material. Here's the DOI that you can look up. And then here you can also provide a link for convenience, right? But the big important thing is here's the DOI. Here's this permanent thing. So if this link, breaks, that's okay. There's still a permanent object identifier. And sort of the cool thing about having your supplemental material as a reference is that now you can do things like just cite your supplemental material in your paper. And that means that you don't need to jam this giant link all over the place in your paper wherever you want to reference your supplemental material. You can reference things in your supplemental material as is appropriate in your results section, in your method section, etc. Okay, so doing citable supplemental material is actually like very trivial with GitHub. So sort of, I'm going into a lot more, there's a lot more stuff that'll be on the slide than I think is necessary, but my intention was that if folks want to reference the slide later, they've got the slide, they've got all the links. So the very first thing that you'll need to do is create an account on GitHub. And you'll also need an account on the service called Zenodo, but you don't even need to make a brand new account on it. You can just log in with your GitHub account. And these are both free things to do, and like as far as I know, they're not like stealing my data or anything. They seem like good services. Then you're going to create a GitHub repository to contain your supplemental material for your manuscript. And if you're already using GitHub as sort of part of your project's workflow, you don't even need to do this. You already have a GitHub repository. So that's great. So this is sort of an optional step if you're not already using GitHub. Then you're just going to shove whatever you want inside of that repository, which you've already done if you use GitHub as part of your project's workflow. So again, if you're already using GitHub, this whole process is super easy. So you can treat the GitHub repository sort of like those nasty zip files. I highly recommend like spending some time organizing the stuff in the GitHub repository. Don't just like toss things in there arbitrarily. Write good readmes, give people some context. But worst case scenario, you can just throw everything inside the GitHub repository. That's fine. Then you're going to log into Zenodo. You can log in with GitHub. So as opposed to creating a new account, just click this button. And then once you're logged in, I think in the top right corner, there's this little drop-down menu. You can just click on the GitHub link or the GitHub option. You're going to have this big list of repositories that are, so basically because you've got your GitHub account and Zenodo account linked, it'll know all about all of your repositories. And you can just go find the one that you want to turn DOI tracking on and just flip the switch from off to on. Then on GitHub, you're going to create a new release on your repository. So if you're already using GitHub, this is probably something you're familiar with, but basically you just go to this create a new release link, and hopefully, you give it a reasonable name and a reasonable description. And basically when you create this release, this is going to tell Zenodo to archive that release and then give it a DOI. And right, so when you go back to look at that list of repositories after you've created a release, you should see something like this where it's like, okay, I saw that you created a release and here's the DOI for that repository. And the really nifty, like a really important detail is that it's archiving the release. So Zenodo will actually download a snapshot of your repository at the release, and they'll host that snapshot so that if something happens to GitHub or to your account or whatever, or your repository gets deleted for any reason, there's still a snapshot of it on Zenodo. So it just sort of increases the permanence of your supplemental material. Other thing you can do, which is totally optional, but I highly recommend, when you're on that list, you can click on this DOI badge on Zenodo, and it'll give you the option to like copy and paste some Markdown or HTML or whatever, and it'll give you a fancy badge that you can paste into your repository's README, so that whenever folks navigate to your repository, there's a DOI right there that they can click on and get the citation information, for your repository. And so actually, whenever, this is often what I do when I want like the Bibtex or the citation for a repository, is I just click on this link from the badge. Somewhere in the bottom right of the page, you can either, like, here's a nicely formatted citation. You can also export it, in Bibtex, which is what I often use. So yeah, that's it. That's the whole process. That's all you need to do to have citable supplemental material with GitHub. It's super easy, and there's actually like an even better guide than what I just talked through here. Yeah, are there any questions about this? Hopefully it's pretty straightforward process.
I have no questions, but I didn't know about Zenodo. That's a really useful feature, and you're absolutely right. I actually had a paper earlier this year that I similarly just have a single link to GitHub, and now I feel kind of embarrassed about doing that. I kind of wish I followed this approach instead.
You shouldn't feel embarrassed at all. Like, I've sort of, every time I write a paper, my supplemental material game has sort of evolved. So definitely several papers ago, I was on that boat. I was just like, oh, a link is good enough. That's fine. And a link is not even that bad, like, if you are responsible about making releases. So if you make sure you just put out a release for the version of the code that is for a paper, usually folks can just like go look at the past releases and find it.
What about evolvable code, as in, like, once you send a paper, I can hear the train in the back.
Oh yeah, let me see.
Usually I hear that at home. So we're talking about the releases and how that sort of makes a static image of the code. Is it easy to see if there's any updated version post-release of the paper? Because, for example, the paper I did earlier this year is an archive paper. There was and a poster paper as well that are sort of early versions of a project. And I'm hoping that later on there'll be a more up-to-date version. And I don't really want to have to make a new GitHub repository every time I do a paper, because that's not really ideal. So if I have this backed up through this tool you're talking about, Zenodo, is it obvious if they click on that there's a newer version of the code as well?
So I think so. And actually, I wonder if this will break the share. Can folks still see my Firefox? Yeah. Okay. So I think if I just go to Zenodo, and then I'll go here, I'll just pick a random repository. The answer is yes. I'm fairly sure. I'll just do this one. That you can cite a specific version. So on Zenodo, if you make multiple releases, Zenodo knows about that. And every time you make a release, I'm fairly sure that it snapshots it.
Right. Okay.
And so in that reference, you can put the DOI for the specific version that you want to reference. The other thing, so that's 100% a thing that you can do. The other thing that I recommend doing is, so if I think this will take me where I want to go, is for any GitHub repository, a good README is very important. Mm-hmm. So if you're using, I'd really recommend at the bottom of your README or somewhere on the README, putting a like, basically some context for the history of the project, and just like, this repository is also associated with this paper published this time. Go look at this release for this version of the for this version of the code or the repository for this paper, which I didn't do on this because, you know, it was only for one paper, but definitely adding that note to your README, I think, is really useful.
That makes sense, especially since GitHub does record all changes over time as well. That would be sensible for everybody reading it. Okay,
Right.
well, thank you for those tips and explanation. Thank you.
Yeah, anything else? If
I've
not,
got
oh,
I've
go
got
ahead,
a
go ahead.
question.
Yeah.
One thing I find myself doing a lot with supplemental material is that it kind of like at the very end of writing a paper, when you have to hit the page limit, you go through and you figure out what are the things that are less important and I can move into supplemental material. And I guess, is there anything that you found is like useful in terms of moving things out of the tech world into this alternate format?
Oh, that's a good question. So I definitely know exactly what you're talking about because I've definitely done that before. I think we've done that together before on various papers. And normally I don't try to like automate going from the LaTeX context to a different context. Normally what I'll do is just, okay, here's this section of the paper that, you know, I'm going to chop out and convert it into some form for supplemental material. I'll just rewrite it in Markdown. And yeah, so it doesn't really do sort of a nice, fun, automated thing. I mean, I guess you could pandoc, you could use pandoc to convert, like if you have a big LaTeX thing into Markdown. But I also find that like having to rewrite spending the time to actually rewrite it into the new format, I mean, as long as it's not 20 pages, is a useful endeavor for me, because that means that I'm going to not include like, you know, the \text some text. I'll actually put it in proper Markdown format.
So is there a reason that you wouldn't just include a PDF in the repository?
Yes. So you can totally include a PDF in the repository, but GitHub knows, and I think GitHub knows how to read PDFs and will display it. But if you can put it in Markdown, that'll play really nice with a lot of other features on GitHub that I'll actually show off in some of the next slides. But but you can definitely just like include a tack on a PDF if you want.
That makes sense. Thanks, Alex. Okay.
And then just make sure, was there anything in that? I'm using the Linux version of. Okay, cool. I just pulled up the chat. All right. Doesn't look like there's any new questions there. Okay, so a couple of benefits to GitHub backed supplemental material. So basically, you can contain arbitrary content. A really big one for me is that the format of that content is not bound by the publication venue. So if the publication venue is just like, we'll only take PNGs and PDFs for your supplemental material, you can sort of get around that by citing a GitHub repository that has whatever you want inside of it. It's also, if GitHub is already part of your project's workflow, it's incredibly low effort to make it citable. It takes 5 or 10 minutes once you've done it once. You also, because you're using Git, you have the entire history of your project inside your supplemental material, which is really nice. Also, and I haven't actually gotten to use this in practice, but in sort of in my brain, I'm thinking of issues and pull requests on GitHub as sort of a way to facilitate communication and collaboration between yourself and anyone interested in replicating or extending your work in the future. So I'll often try to include in in the README or like a landing page for my supplemental material, like, hey, if you have any issues with replicating this, or you just want to chat, file it. Like, one of the ways you can do that is file an issue on the repository. And then the other nice thing that we already talked about a little bit is Zenodo will archive your release. So your supplemental material will exist even if the GitHub repository or your GitHub account are deleted or altered. And so, I mean, obviously there's a point of failure here with Zenodo. So if Zenodo goes under, you lose your archive, your archived release. But I mean, hopefully a service that's entire job is to provide permanent object identifiers. It's not, you know, will stick around permanently, but yeah. Okay. Yeah. Click on that. Okay, so now that we're all hopefully comfortable citing a GitHub repository for supplemental material, there are tons of things that you can do. GitHub is this awesome service with all sorts of integrations with other services, and there are lots of tools that play nice with GitHub repositories. So we can take advantage of all those extra bells and whistles to create some really nice, pleasant supplemental material. So I'm just going to click on this link and just give you an example of something that I think Matthew and I put together recently, where we turned our supplemental material into a fancy ebook, which it just makes me so happy every time I see this supplemental material as an ebook. And so I'll sort of, the next couple of slides, I'll talk through sort of what tools we used to put this together. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay, so one of the things that that I've used in the past, so before I mentioned that GitHub is a really bad place to put large amounts of data. One option for storing data that I've liked using has been the Open Science Framework. So Open Science Framework, you can create a repository. They'll give you a citable DOI that you can reference from your manuscript or your supplemental material. So if you, for any reason, want to reference your data and your supplement on GitHub separately, you can. It has all sorts of integrations, so you can connect your OSF repository with a GitHub repository. So like, here's just a screen grab. It's probably like sort of small text, but this OSF repo is connected to this GitHub repository. You can also throw data, arbitrary data files into it. So it's got a bunch of zipped up and tarred data files in here. It's got a nice API that you can talk to via a really useful Python library that I've linked here. So you can do fancy stuff like write scripts that will automatically, like you write a bash script that'll just download all of your data, organize it for you, run your analyses. So it makes it really useful for like replicating your analyses on a different machine. Recently though, so one downside with OSF is, I think recently they put a 50 gigabyte limit on each of these repositories, which is obviously a big problem for projects that have tons of data. I haven't run into this 50 gigabyte limit yet. So for me, just OSF has been totally fine. But I know for a lot of computational research, 50 gigabytes is just way too small. The nice thing, and I think maybe Matthew can say a couple of things about it, but OSF has a bunch of integrations with other data storage, cloud storage services. So you can have your data on those services and then link them sort of in a really legit way to your repository on OSF. And I think Matthew, you've used, was it Amazon S3?
Yeah, I've used their S3 integration. It's nice. That it gives you a clickable, browsable file tree of the S3 repository, yeah, it works. It's pretty easy to set up, and they have really good, because they're not, one of the upsides of, you know, not being aimed at primarily computational people in terms of who they see as their kind of their client base. They have really good how-tos that are super detailed. So that's one thing that I've really enjoyed using their stuff.
Does the OSF client still work for the like accessing the S3 data?
I haven't tried it using the S3 data. I've been using Amazon's clients just to get when I want to get directly at that.
Sure.
The downside of like OSF is like if you want to incorporate it into like high throughput operations for like, oh, I'm going to just upload 10,000 files to the OSF, or I'm going to have all of my 100 jobs try to upload a file at the same time or something. That breaks their service. And I had the privilege of having them open a support ticket with me to stop basically crashing their service.
Yeah.
I've learned that you have to kind of use it responsibly and think about maybe not doing hundreds of things at once, or think about kind of the limitations of their backend.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. That's good to know, because I know a lot of folks here are computational folks. So yeah, you're just gonna have to, do I have so much data and so much throughput that OSF is a bad choice for me? If it is, then maybe probably use something else. But for small amounts of data, I found that OSF has been great. Another sort of big tool that I use all the time for pretty much everything I do on GitHub is Github Pages. And so Github Pages is a really nifty feature where you can go into your repository settings, and I think there's this like Pages tab on your settings, and basically flip a switch. And when you flip the switch, what it'll do is it'll turn on their sort of static website generator. So anytime you push a change to your GitHub repository on GitHub's end, they'll like, okay, we see that you pushed a change. They'll run a static website generator. Specifically, they'll use Jekyll to convert whatever's in your repository into a website, and then publish that website. So like basically you flip the switch, you get a website out of the deal. With a little bit of caveats. They're not like, they're using Jekyll. And if you want to use this, I really recommend at least reading like Getting Started with Jekyll or something. And like, basically, if you have a README, it'll just turn your README, your root README into your homepage, which is really great. I think so. Like, for example, for all these screenshots, I just made a GitHub repository for this. And this repository, I think, only has a README and this little _config that GitHub will make automatically for you when you turn on GitHub Pages. And so with this repository, when I turned on GitHub Pages, it made this fancy, not super fancy, but decent website automatically for me. I had no extra effort on my part. So yeah, even if you're using just GitHub Pages at the most basic level, it's sort of, I found it to be a really useful tool. If you delve into like into Jekyll, learn how to use Jekyll, you can do some really, really fancy, nice things. Like you can write sort of scripts inside of your HTML to automatically generate content from data files, etc. You also don't have to use Jekyll. So whenever you push with GitHub Pages to a repository, GitHub Pages by default will use Jekyll to generate the website, but you can include a file called like .nojekyll and it won't run Jekyll. And that's really useful when you want to generate the website on your end. Either you want to hand write your HTML or you're using some other tool, and you just push the website up to either your main branch or maybe a GitHub Pages branch. And you don't want it to run Jekyll, you just want it to use what you give it. it'll totally do that. It'll be happy doing that. That's fine too. So yeah, I super recommend checking out GitHub Pages. There's a couple of useful tools down here. Another useful service, or not useful service, but useful thing to do that I always love seeing and I always love doing are Readme badges. So there, a lot of the services that I've talked about so far, like Zenodo or OSF, will just give you, you can usually have to like go sort of dig for it, but they'll give you a badge that you can paste into your README. And badges are super useful for folks looking at your README to at a glance get an idea of what's inside the repository, or like useful links from your repository. They also just make your repository look really fancy. Like I'm always just very impressed when I see, you know, a wall of badges. So you can do things like, okay, your publication, maybe you posted a preprint, so you can create a badge for your preprint. Or maybe you're using GitHub Pages to host a web version of your supplemental material. Okay, we'll post a link to that. You can provide the DOI for your supplemental material, link to your data, etc. If you've got tests that you're running on some continuous integration service, they'll usually give you a badge that will indicate whether or not your tests are passing. You can also, so a really nifty tool that I use a lot is sort of this shields.io website. And so you can create custom arbitrary badges really easily. I think, yeah, if you just poke around on this website, they have pretty good explanation for how to do that. Like I think this badge, and this badge are all custom badges that are using that shield.io site. So badges are awesome. I super recommend, you know, using badges, learning how to use badges. For R users, if you're not using R Markdown, that's fine, but like maybe consider looking into using R Markdown. R Markdown is awesome. And basically it lets you interweave your R analyses and visualizations with plain text explanations in Markdown. And then what you can do after you've written this R Markdown file, you can use a tool called knitr to compile that R Markdown document into HTML. And the nifty thing about that is that if you've turned on GitHub Pages on your repository that has your supplemental material, and you push this HTML up to your repository or use GitHub Actions to automatically generate it, you basically, like GitHub will host your analyses for free. So you get, for free, you get this website that has like your graphs, your code all embedded, a nice table of contents. So I found this to be a really nifty way to communicate basically all of the analyses and all of the code that I use to generate the graphs and visualizations for a paper. Also for Jupyter Notebook users, because I know quite a bit of people, instead of using R, they might use Python. And instead of R Markdown, they'll use Jupyter Notebooks. You can totally do all the same things, interweave your code, your Python code with Markdown code, and you can use tools to export those notebooks as HTML files, which then you could sort of do the same thing where you host, push the HTML up to your repository. You've got a nifty, really cool web page. Let's see, and Ken just mentioned that, yep, Jupyter Notebooks allow R, so you can use Markdown there instead of R Markdown. Yeah, it's probably more portable that way. Yeah, I think I agree with that. I'm not sure. I have to think about that a little bit. You can also use Python instead of R Markdown, but and you can actually do wonky things where you actually have your Python code interact with your R code, which I think you can also do in Jupyter Notebooks as well using this reticulate package. Yeah, okay, so this is a super nifty thing, and hopefully it is clear how this can be used to improve your supplemental material. Okay, so another nifty thing, and this is building on the R Markdown, and also that comment by Charles, why not just put a PDF into your GitHub repository? Well, if you instead convert your supplement, if you instead you do all of your supplemental material in Markdown, you can use this really cool tool called Bookdown to turn your supplemental material into a fancy ebook. And so basically, Bookdown, it will take all of your R Markdown analyses that you tell it about and all of your Markdown documentation, and it'll compose, you throw it all in, and it'll spit out basically an ebook. And the nifty thing is that it generates all of these really fancy features for you automatically, like this fancy table of contents. I think there's a search bar that it'll build in. It'll let you automatically download a PDF of your supplemental material or the ebook. If you use R Markdown, I super recommend checking out Bookdown. You can host your compiled ebook on GitHub Pages. So this is sort of one scenario where you don't want to use Jekyll. You want to basically run Bookdown and have Bookdown generate the website. I think I wrote a blog post and sort of put together a demo for that here. Other sort of nifty thing that I really like about Bookdown, you can even use Bibtex to manage your citations and references inside of your supplemental material. So like, I think if I click on this, if I go to the very end, here's all the references. This is all automatically generated for me from a Bibtex file. So I'm always just super impressed by that.
So it sounds like you're saying that we should try and start convincing journals to just make the paper itself in Bookdown. Forget about the supplementary material. I mean, also.
Yeah. I know there have been a couple of books. So the only reason I found out about Bookdown was there are a couple of books that I really like that are they're written entirely in Bookdown. I think Klaus Wilke's data visualization book that I love is all written in R Markdown files and then like use Bookdown to turn into a book. It's sort of a beautiful book it's a great book in content, but it's also a beautiful book in formatting. Yeah, and then so for Jupyter Notebook users, I know there's the tool called Jupyter Book that you can do basically the same thing with. So if you're a Jupyter Notebook user, I recommend sort of trying that out. And then like getting back to me, I haven't used Jupyter Book myself, but I'm curious. I'd be really curious to see someone use it and hear about their experience. Okay, so another sort of behind the scenes tool that I use a lot for supplemental material is GitHub Actions. So GitHub Actions is I think it's a relatively new, like last couple of years sort of feature on GitHub. And it sort of lets you basically trigger automated actions that happen in response to you making changes to your repository. And you can do all sorts of things with this. So like you can do continuous integration testing with it. There's a ton of things. GitHub has this huge marketplace of basically off-the-shelf really useful actions that you can check out. For supplemental material specifically, what I often do is I'll set up a GitHub action that just watches for changes to whatever, my main branch. And then that GitHub action will automatically go off and download the data. It installs all the dependencies for doing whatever analyses that I'm doing. So usually R and a bunch of R packages, etc. And it'll basically run my analyses on the data to make sure that it all works. And then if it all works, I'll have it run Bookdown to spit out an ebook. And then it'll push that ebook to a GitHub Pages branch on the repository so that I never actually have to run ebook, like the Bookdown software on my computer. And I'm never pushing the book, like the ebook to GitHub. It's GitHub Actions doing that all behind the scenes. And so again, I think I linked this on the previous slide, but if you want to sort of see how that all works, I wrote a blog post about it. I have a demo. I think you could probably use this is probably also would be useful for if you're using Jupyter, the Jupyter book tool as well. Other really useful things that I've used GitHub Actions for. So like I often use Overleaf to write papers. So Overleaf, you can think of it as like Google Docs but for LaTeX. And so it's really great if all of your collaborators are happy and familiar with LaTeX. It's not so great if you've got a collaborator that has never used LaTeX before or doesn't like LaTeX for whatever reason, and they're just much more comfortable sort of reading and editing in Word, or even just giving feedback from a Word document. So I've actually, with Overleaf, you can hook your Overleaf project to a GitHub repository. Like it's all built in. You just like dig into the menus and like link to a GitHub. It's pretty straightforward. If people are curious, I'm happy to like show them how I do it. And once you do that, you can set up a GitHub action to whenever you make changes, whenever basically you make changes to the LaTeX project in Overleaf, and you sort of sync that Overleaf project with GitHub, it'll automatically convert the LaTeX source into a Word document. And then like you can just download the Word document from the action. And I found that to be incredibly useful. Yeah, GitHub Actions are awesome. I super recommend people checking them out. Happy to talk about them more after this. I think, yeah, this is the last sort of behind the scenes tool that I use a lot for sort of composing supplemental material, and that's Docker and Docker Hub. So Docker lets you, and my explanation might be a little bit wonky. I think, Matthew, feel free to jump in if I say something that's wrong. But Docker, so basically Docker lets you create this Docker file that describes a computational environment that you need to compile and run your code. And so this makes it super easy to specify sort of instructions for other folks to replicate and run your code, sort of as opposed to just like, here are the, here's the set of dependencies you need, here's, the commands you need to run on your local machine. You can give them a Docker file, or even better, a link to a project on Docker Hub that just has, like, the Docker file will basically provide all the instructions that Docker needs to like generate your computational environment. And then if you link things up with Docker Hub, it'll build an image of that environment for you. And then folks can just like pull that image down, create a container, and like work inside of that container. And so I found that to be super useful for, so basically what I'll do for supplemental material is or for projects, is I'll write a Docker file that contains all of the like dependencies and instructions to download my data from OSF, run my analyses, generate the ebook with Bookdown, and compile whatever software. And so that just means the instructions for replicating is like, hey, go pull down this Docker Hub image and like just jump inside of the, make a container, jump inside the container, and everything is just there for you. One sort of bummer thing that I found out yesterday is I think Docker Hub, there were bad actors on Docker Hub and they're taking away auto build for free users. And that just means that you're not going to be like, when you hook up a Docker Hub repository with a GitHub repository, it'll no longer, pay attention to changes to the GitHub repository and automatically build your image if you have a Docker file in your GitHub repository. It's sort of a bummer. This isn't in, I think this goes into effect on the 18th of this month. So I don't actually know what it's going to look like after it goes away. So it's possible that Docker Hub becomes a lot less useful after the 18th. Yeah. Okay, so that's basically everything that I wanted to talk about. So those are basically all the tools that I use to sort of compose what I think are fancy supplemental material for paper. So for papers. So I was sort of hoping that with whatever time we have left, which might be like 5 to 10 minutes, I don't know, basically however long people want to stick around. If I was sort of curious about a couple of things. So one, I'm happy to take any questions, or we can talk about anything that anybody wants to talk about. But I was also sort of curious what folks see as the downsides to this GitHub-based supplemental material approach. I'm also curious what folks what they're trying to communicate with your supplemental material. Are there things that sort of this GitHub approach doesn't communicate well or does communicate well? Or sort of things that you've seen or done for supplemental material that you've liked or didn't like, and then any tools or services you found to be useful. I'm always on the hunt for new tools and services. So yeah, happy to open it up for conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. That was a
go ahead.
Great chat. Thank you so much. That was really insightful, because my understanding of supplemental materials has always just been a single PDF, if anything at all. And so I have never bothered, because I think, like many of my colleagues in computing science, PDFs are generally useless for us, for containing, as you said, data and formula are fine, but formulae are fine, but it's not great for code. It's not great for data. So this was enlightening. Thank you. Sorry, I'll let the questions come in.
I was just going to mention that one way you can get around that Docker Hub build service going away is adding a GitHub Actions that builds your Docker image and then just pushes it right to Docker Hub.
That's clever.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's really easy to do. Oh, thanks, Matthew.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, GitHub Actions are basically just awesome. They're great. I was sad when I saw Travis CI, like the continuous integration service, sort of die slowly over however many years it slowly died. But I was happy to know that we could replace it with GitHub Actions. There.
I should also mention all the supplemental material is available on the, in fact, let me get the link and I'll share it here before I forget, on the Banzaf Lab website for the Skills Workshop. That's in the chat there. So all the materials for the slides and the slides themselves are available through that link. Although please be aware that the website is being updated in the next week, so things might go offline temporarily in the next little while. So grab it while you can.
Question.
Go ahead.
Have you thought about snapshotting the website itself and putting that on something like OSF?
Oh, that's a fantastic idea. I have not thought about that, but I love that.
Because I was just thinking about, like Wayback Machine and stuff like that.
Right. How do we make right. And because Zenodo will snapshot and OSF will snapshot your repository at a particular release, but like it doesn't snapshot that ebook. Well, I mean, it snapshots the raw source for the ebook, which is less useful. But yeah, no, I love the idea of like just to increase the permanence of the ebook form of the supplemental material. Because I think if you're doing supplemental material as an ebook, that is the intended medium that you want folks to interact with it. So I love the idea of snapshotting it.
So, Jory, are you then suggesting that the snapshot would be the primary place you point people toward, or would you still point them to GitHub?
Oh, I was imagining even just like a zip file backup in case.
So just as a backup,
posting goes down.
Yeah, and I guess probably GitHub keeps things a little bit more live and interactive than what you could do on OSF.
Yeah, and so one thing, let me see if I can find here. So one thing that I'll do with these ebooks is I try to make sure that the DOI does not point to the ebook itself. where can I get to the repository? The DOI I always make sure the DOI points to the repository, and then I just try to make the ebook easy to get to from there. Which I think there are a couple, like you could go here, you could go here. And that's just because like this ebook link is even more of a point of failure than the GitHub repository link, because it's also assuming that my domain name stays the same. So like this is a link that I'm always hesitant to paste into a manuscript. But
I mean, I find that interesting because if it's a domain name that you own, it's, you know, I actually feel like that's more stable than a domain name that I don't own, in that I at least have control over it. Whereas if I'm using any company, you know, or anything, it could just go away. Like,
sure.
For example, I prefer to put things on my own domains than on MSU, because if ever I leave MSU, they'll just wipe out everything I have here.
Right.
I have the same concern with email addresses, and that's why I don't give out my MSU email address as my work email. I use my personal one, so at least I can manage it in the future.
Yeah. The one thing I'll note, sort of reason that I think that this domain is like pretty unstable relative to like the GitHub one, is I think for you it might not be more unstable, because you know that you're probably always going to have your personal website, own that domain. But for someone who's more junior, where you might only want to pay $15 a month, like let's say that you pay $15 a month for your domain name while you're a graduate student or a postdoc, you're happy to do that because it's a really useful thing to do. You get a job in industry, and maybe you don't want to pay for that domain name anymore because it doesn't matter. Basically, I've seen a bunch of links like this to where formally
I'm a little confused about $15 a month and where that comes from. I mean,
you know, whatever your domain name costs.
Okay, I mean, normally it's like $10 a year.
Oh yeah, no, okay, yeah, definitely. $15 a month was not the correct figure. Some cost for, yes, I don't pay $15 a month.
And I just mean that as in terms of, yeah, and I agree. I mean, it certainly becomes much more stable once you're sure you're going to want to stay in academia. But I would, if I were you, I mean, lalejini.com seems like such a useful name. I would never want to get rid of it.
Sure, and I agree. I'm just saying that I'm not going to, in general, recommend that folks use this, because I've seen links where they clearly, you know, had a domain name at one point,
right,
and then it was less useful, so they stopped paying for their domain name, and now the link is broken.
I say this as someone who has so many domain names that I have my own reseller account just to get the discount. So
Sure.
The potential problem comes in uncertain change, like through death or illness or something else.
Absolutely.
I mean, if I passed away suddenly, I know my domain name wouldn't be paid for by anybody else because nobody would even know how to do it.
Yeah.
So
no, that's a really good point. Yeah.
Does anyone know if there are GitHub badges for bus factor on that point?
Bus factor. Oh, like that's a good one.
Oh, like if you got hit,
yeah.
bus factor being like if you got hit by a bus, what would happen?
Yeah, so like teams with a very low bus factor are more susceptible to information loss.
So you could definitely create a custom one. I have no idea if anyone's, you know, put together a service.
Although I don't know if I want my name tied.
It's kind of fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I think we saw Facebook was kind of the first big company to consider death for online accounts. And you can, you know, other people can set request memoriams upon a page where the person is deceased. And I feel like almost this should be the future of lawyers. There should be, you know, things in place that say, in the event of my death, my, you know, liquidate my estate, and then 5% can go into funding my website and this service and that service with my data for this many years. But at the moment, I feel like that's not quite the standard.
Yeah, I'm not sure if GitHub has a policy and what their policy is. I'm sort of curious if anyone.
I remember setting up like a next of like I think I set up my brother to run my GitHub account if like I become incapacitated. I don't remember if they like put up a little dialogue or like, oh, you should set this up, or like if I had to go digging for that. But I
Yeah.
think GitHub at least has that as an option. I have no idea how it works and how they would know if I'm dead.
I
But
just Googled it. It says it's actually inside their user policy. They say in the event that GitHub user passes away, we can work with an authorized individual to determine what happens to your account's content. So if you are next of kin, a pre-designated successor or other authorized individual, then they can do something about it. But you need to authorize it while you're alive. So there is actually that form there you can click on if you want to set up an authorized user for an event of your death. Again, the problem I think is that each individual service we need something set up. I think this needs to perhaps become a single point of failure somewhere. You know, that there should be.
So I mean, I'm sure you
lot of-
don't need to set it up ahead of time. I'm sure if you have a why am I blanking on the term?
Death certificate.
Right, but not just a death certificate, but if you have the
power of attorney.
yeah, not there's a court order of who's supposed to take care of the final affairs. I'm just forgetting the term, but it happens automatically, right? It's a very quick and an easy thing to do. And then you automatically get power of attorney with that, and all of these sorts of things are much easier. Yeah.
One thing that I've found useful about like putting URLs and manuscripts in places where I won't be able to change the URL later is you can actually use a Jekyll site. Instead of serving up little blog posts, it can serve up redirect pages. And so you can kind of use that to hack together your own URL shortener. And then if the manuscript goes to your URL shortener, and for some reason wherever you're pointing to changes or becomes unavailable and you have to do something else, you can kind of change that redirect. And so the downside, of course, being that you won't really know about that potentially being an issue unless somebody complains to you that this URL is broken. Or something big happens where you're like, oh, I bet a bunch of my URLs are broken now. I should go through and check on them.
I bet there's a GitHub action off the shelf that would like poke all the links. Maybe.
There totally is, yeah.
There's also tools such as Linktree that you can set up for as a sort of, I don't know if you're familiar, but Linktree is often used by internet personalities. So it's sort of like a portal for all of the links relating to you online. So I've got one set up for myself as well as my podcast and the like, so that when people want to find our Facebook or Instagram, wherever else, it's all in one place. So you could do the same thing for perhaps each paper. You could have a link tree for this, for either a paper or for an individual person, and then you could say this is where all similar problem again, though a single point of failure, but it could be useful.
That seems really great for like if you're presenting the paper somewhere. Like I sort of love the idea of here's this, because I assume Linktree, like if Instagram influencers are using it, then like it's probably nice to look at. So it seems like a great thing to like, okay, I'm giving this talk, go to this Linktree link for all the relevant stuff for this paper.
There's an example of my one in the chat if anybody's curious. It's just a list of text really, and you can customize the colors and stuff if you want.
Yeah, no, this is great.
I hadn't actually considered the use of that in academia before. It could be quite useful.
Yeah, I'm hoping I remember this so that I can try it out the next like talk or something.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. This has been recorded, so it will be available, and all the materials are also available on the website. Assuming I can find a place funnily enough to host this. So thank you so much for hosting, Alex. I really appreciate that. It was a
Yeah.
really interesting set of resources and discussion. I never really thought of the complexities that could come with supplementary materials and data and such. So thank you for exploring that. And I also have your blog post there, I believe, in the links, so people can explore it in textual format as well.
Yep. Thanks for organizing. This was a lot of fun, and thanks everyone for participating in discussions.
Yeah,